Imagine a man that nobody ever took seriously. A loser who couldn't hold down a single job. A former chicken farmer, a bankrupt businessman, the manager of a cheap hotel. You have to admit, this portrait doesn't look anything like the image of a super spy we pay to see in the movies. In the movies, it's all glamorous. Think of a dashing hero in a tuxedo, fast cars, explosions, and beautiful women. In real life, it was completely different. The most effective and important spy of World War II turned out to be a chubby, balding Spaniard with the face of a gardener and the body of a clerk, who was hired, for his own money, by both warring sides simultaneously. If you like stories that give you goosebumps and make your head spin, you've come to the right place. Today, I'm going to tell you about Juan Pujol Garcia, a man who just wanted to do some good, and ended up receiving the Iron Cross personally from Hitler and the Order of the British Empire from King George VI. And he got both for the exact same thing. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss even crazier stories, and let's dive in. An ordinary guy from Barcelona. To understand how Juan Pujol got to where he did in 1941, we need to dig a little deeper than just that year. He was born in Barcelona in 1912 into a fairly well-off family that owned a textile factory. His father was a Catalan industrialist, his mother a strict Catholic from Andalusia. Seems normal enough, but if you think Juan dreamed of heroic exploits and espionage from childhood, you'd be wrong. He dreamed of birds. Seriously. He studied poultry farming at the Royal School of Poultry Farming in Arenys de Mar and managed to go bankrupt in that business long before he started fooling the Nazis. His life before the war was a classic story of someone trying to find their way. He worked in a pet shop, managed a chicken farm, and was even the manager of a cinema. Nothing heroic. In 1931, he served in the army in a cavalry regiment and, by his own admission, realized a military career wasn't for him. He hated horseback riding and frankly admitted he lacked the qualities inherent in a soldier: loyalty, generosity, and honor. Honest self-assessment, right? But then the Spanish Civil War broke out. And that's when the mind of the young Catalan really started to get twisted. Imagine a country tearing itself apart. On one side, the Republicans, communists, and anarchists who seized his father's factory. On the other, Franco's Phalangists, backed by the Nazis and fascists. Juan found himself between a rock and a hard place. First, he was drafted into the Republican Army. But he fled, hid out with a girlfriend, was caught in a roundup, and ended up in jail. He was bailed out by some right-wing activists, given fake documents, and found himself back in the army, this time with the sole intention of deserting at the first opportunity. He worked as a signalman, laying cables at the front, and finally, in 1938, during the Battle of the Ebro, he crossed the lines to the Nationalists. And what do you think? They didn't exactly welcome him with open arms either. In the Nationalist Army, he dared to express sympathy for the monarchy, showing how complicated things were in Spain, and immediately got slapped in the face by a colonel and thrown back in jail. In the end, this man, who had experienced both armies, proudly stated that he hadn't fired a single shot during the entire war. And so our hero was born. A man who had felt firsthand what fanaticism on the left and fanaticism on the right meant. He grew to hate both fascism and communism. And when, in 1940, all of Europe was already ablaze in World War II, Juan, now managing a cheap hotel in Madrid, sat and thought, what can I do? He saw the Nazis steamrolling across Europe, and the only country putting up a fight was Britain. And he decided, I'll go be a spy for the British. Help humanity out. Sounds naive, right? Take me as a spy. We don't offer that service. So, we arrive in 1941. Juan Pujol Garcia, who had never been to England, didn't know the language and knew nothing about intelligence, walks into the British Embassy in Madrid. He probably thought there'd be a M figure like in the James Bond books, complete with a secretary and an intercom. Imagine his disappointment. Hello? I'd like to be a spy for your queen. The British officers probably nearly choked on their tea. They looked at this pudgy Catalan with the simple face and politely said, Sorry, old chap, but that's not a service we offer at the embassy. And they showed him out. Juan didn't give up. He went a second time, then a third. Still nothing. Any normal person would have spat and gone back to raising chickens. But not Juan. He was stubborn as a mule like his Catalan ancestors. And then, a brilliant plan formed in his head, worthy of its own movie. He reasoned like this: if the British don't want me, I need to make them want me. How? Very simple. If I become a top-notch German spy, the British will have to get interested in me. The logic was ironclad, though risky, and so one went straight to the German embassy. Agent Alaric and Lisbon Coffee. At the German embassy, one turned on all his acting skills. He played the role of a fanatical phalangist who hated the British and was burning with desire to serve the Führer. He waved his arms, swore loyalty, and claimed he had access to London for business trips. The Germans weren't born yesterday, of course, but they were desperately short of agents in Spain. And here was one volunteering. An Abwehr officer, Friedrich Napredi, codename Federico, decided to give the Spaniard a chance. Berlin gave the green light. Juan was taught the basics: how to write in invisible ink, use ciphers, given money, a whole £600, by the way, and assigned the agent codename Alaric. His mission: go to England and recruit agents. And here's where the funny and brilliant part begins. Juan left, but not for England. He went to Lisbon and settled down in a quiet spot, sipping coffee. So how did he gather his secret intelligence? He didn't. He went to the public library in Lisbon. He read British newspapers and magazines. He bought tourist guidebooks to Great Britain and railway timetables. He went to the cinema and watched newsreels. In short, he sat and made it all up. He described fleet movements after reading news about ship arrivals in ports. He described the locations of military units by spotting notices about officer transfers in the papers. He even gave prices for train fares, checking them against the timetables. He tripped up once, though. The British monetary system back then was fiendishly complicated. Pounds, shillings, pence. Juan got lost in the calculations, so in his expense reports, he simply wrote, "Here are my expenses, we'll send the total later." The Germans were delighted. Their agent in England was working, sending coded messages that seemed to hit the mark. They had no idea their best agent had never even set foot in foggy Albion. Meanwhile, Juan went a step further. He realized one man alone wasn't enough. So he created an entire network of non-existent subordinates. He gave them names, biographies, personalities. He had an agent in Glasgow, a Scotsman supposedly working in the docks. There was a disillusioned Dutch pilot, a secretary from the Ministry of Information in London, a whole gang of fictional characters. If the Germans started to get suspicious, Juan would blame it on his agents. Oh, this one got drunk. That one got sick. The other made a mistake. Genius, right? London in a panic. Now let's shift to London, to the grey buildings of MI5. Serious men in suits are reading decrypted intercepts of German radio traffic. And they're panicking. My God, the Germans have a new super agent operating in England. He has a whole network. He knows everything about our convoys. The hunt for the ghost was on. At MI5, the case was taken on by Tomas Harris, head of the Spanish section, who, incidentally, spoke excellent Spanish. He started analyzing Alaric's reports. And the more he read, the wider his smile became. He saw the information was valuable, but strange. It was either outdated, simply taken from open sources, or downright fabricated. But the Germans believed it. The climax came when, following one of Juan's reports, the Germans sent an entire naval squadron to intercept a British convoy. A convoy that didn't exist. A convoy Juan had invented. Then it dawned on the British. This wasn't just any spy. This was a gold mine. If the Germans trusted this eccentric so much, they didn't need to catch him. They needed to recruit him. Garbo versus Alaric. And so the dreamer's dream came true. Juan became a double agent. The British brought him and his family to England in the spring of 1942. They first gave him the codename Bovril, after the meat extract, but then realized that was dull and renamed him Garbo, after Greta Garbo, because he was the greatest actor in the world. Imagine the irony of fate. Now Juan Pujol, sitting in London under MI5's control, continues writing letters to the Germans. But every word is now cleared with British intelligence. He sends the Germans real information but useless information, or slightly delayed information, or half-truths. Here's an interesting economic angle. The Nazis paid one a fortune. They thought they were funding a huge network of 27 agents. One got paid for himself and for every imaginary agent. The Germans transferred currency, often in dollars, which were a serious resource back then. The British, naturally, controlled it all. You could say Juan wasn't just fooling the Germans. He was subsidizing the British economy with Third Reich money. Well, he personally pocketed $1 million of those dollars later. In the autumn of 1942, the British planned Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. They needed to distract the Germans. Juan was tasked with sending information about it to Berlin, but with a delay. He sent a coded message about a huge fleet painted in Mediterranean camouflage putting to sea. But the message arrived in Berlin an hour after the British had already landed. The Germans read it, threw up their hands. Ah, what a valuable agent! Such a shame the radiogram was delayed. And they gave Juan a bonus. The greatest show on earth. Operation Fortitude. But all that was just a warm-up. The main event came in 1944. The opening of the Second Front was months away. Everyone knew the Allies would land in Europe. The Germans knew it too and were fortifying the Atlantic Wall. A wall of concrete and steel. The only question was, where? And this is where the British launched Operation Fortitude. It was the greatest disinformation operation in human history. They wanted to convince Hitler that the landings would be not in Normandy, but in the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest part of the English Channel. To do this, they built an entire Phantom Army, the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, under the command of General Patton. Yes, the very same flamboyant Patton, whom the Germans considered the Allies' best commander. Patton was put in charge of an army that didn't exist. Along the coast in the counties of Kent and Sussex, they set up inflatable tanks, plywood airplanes, and dummy landing craft. German reconnaissance planes photographed it all, and photo analysts in Berlin reported, yes, enormous forces are concentrated there. To make it even more convincing, the British had real radio operators simulate radio traffic between non-existent divisions. The Phantom Army lived its own life. And at the center of this grand deception stood a fat Spaniard who looked like an accountant. Juan Pujol became the main channel through which the British fed the Germans disinformation. He sent panicked messages to Berlin from his imaginary agents. One wrote that tanks were concentrated in Dover. Another reported that Patton was reviewing the troops. A third claimed landing craft were being loaded in ports, clearly targeting Calais. Juan worked like a dog. Sometimes he went on the air 20 times a day. The Germans saw this and thought, what a hard-working Alaric we have. He must be working day and night trying to uncover the enemy's plans. They couldn't even imagine that right next to Alaric sat his Mi-5 handler dictating what to write. And then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. The Allies landed in Normandy. Hitler, upon hearing the news, reportedly said something like, well, that's a diversionary maneuver. The real blow will come at Calais. And he kept 19 divisions in the Pas-de-Calais area for 2 months after the landings, waiting for an invasion that never came. By the time the Führer realized he'd been duped, it was too late. The Allies had established a foothold in France and were pushing the Nazis back towards the German border. This whole story is a brilliant example of how information becomes a weapon. The Germans, so proud of their meticulousness and technology, they had enigma, after all, were blinded by their own belief in their infallibility. The Iron Cross and the Order of the British Empire in the same hands. And now for the climax. The Germans were so grateful to their agent Alaric, who they believed had done a titanic job, that in July 1944, after the Normandy landings, Hitler personally signed the decree awarding Juan Pujol Garcia the Iron Cross Second Class. The award was read out to him over the radio. The receiver in London, naturally, recorded it all. But that's not all. The British, of course, knew exactly who they had in their pocket. A few months later, in November 1944, King George VI awarded Juan the Order of the British Empire, MBE, for services to the Crown. For the exact same thing. Can you imagine the look on that man's face? In his box, he had two medals. On one side, a cross with a Nazi swastika signed by Hitler. On the other, an order from the British monarch. And he earned both honestly. Just for some he was a hero, for others also a hero. Once upon a time there was a spy. After the war, Juan had problems. He feared revenge from surviving Nazis. In 1949, MI5 faked his death from malaria in Angola. Everyone believed it. His first wife and son thought he was gone. Meanwhile, Juan had skipped town to Venezuela. With that $1 million the Germans had given him to maintain his agent network. He settled in the quiet village of Caroni, opened a bookshop, then a souvenir shop, a cinema. He remarried a Venezuelan woman and had more children. None of the neighbors knew that this quiet, pot-bellied guy selling trinkets had once fooled Hitler himself. When his children grew up, Juan would sometimes joke, "You know, your dad was a spy." The kids would laugh and tell him not to joke like that. They thought the old man had lost his marbles. Almost 40 years passed like this. In 1984, British historian and writer Nigel West, a specialist in intelligence services, stumbled upon this case. It seemed strange to him that such an important witness had died so conveniently and neatly. West started digging and eventually found Juan alive and well in Venezuela. For Pujol, it was a shock, but he agreed to come to London. And there, a scene worthy of Hollywood unfolded. At Heathrow Airport, he was met by old men from MI5, the very ones he'd worked with in the 40s. They embraced and wept. Then he was invited to Buckingham Palace, where the Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen's husband, shook his hand and said, "You did a great thing." So, a farmer, a failure, and a fantasist became a legend. He died in 1988 in Caracas, at the age of 76. The real Garbo. There's an important lesson in this story for us. Living today. We live in the information age. Fakes, propaganda, disinformation. It all seems like a product of the internet. But really, it was all invented 80 years ago. The story of Juan Pujol shows just how fragile our perception of reality can be if there's one talented liar out there. Or truth teller, depending on your perspective. And now a question for you, my reader. How many Alarics do you think are working for various intelligence agencies today? And are they believed as blindly as the Germans believed a Spaniard with a railway timetable? Write your opinion in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you think. And don't forget to subscribe. There are plenty more incredible stories ahead that will blow your mind.